going to be talking today about the Quietist controversy, which rocked the world for 400 years. How many of you have heard of Quietism even? It's not a topic we hear too much about now, but it was a big deal for a while. In fact, all the way into the middle of the 20th century. I think you can turn it down just a little bit. To give a context of where we are, I've put this page up here, and there's one other piece that I should have probably put in there, and that's the year 1440, printing press. I think you can. It's one of these watershed dates where you can talk about the world before and after something. The world before and after the printing press. It's a different world after the printing press. So we've been sort of hanging out in this zone of 1500s and 1600s for our last few presentations, and that's a really pivotal time in history. Things are really changing. A shift is going on in terms of world periods from pre-modernity toward modernity, moving into the Renaissance period in Europe, the Enlightenment period, a shift even in terms of how we understand ourselves as Christians and church. All of that is happening. And we've heard presentations on Luther and Ignatius, John of the Cross, and Teresa of Avila. Of course, earlier on Francis of Assisi and Dominic and their contributions to Christian spirituality. So we're still going to be hanging around that period, but just after the time of John of the Cross and Teresa and what happened after their writings. I should mention in the beginning that when St. Teresa wrote, she wrote first of all in response to her spiritual director's request, might be putting it mildly, order that she write her autobiography and other reflections. And she wrote them primarily for the sisters. She wasn't writing them for Doubleday or Random House or any other big-time European publisher that might have been emerging at the time. She wrote them as guidance for the sisters in Discalced Carmelite convents. Okay, that's the context of her writing. John of the Cross wrote his works primarily as reflections on his mystical experiences, breaking open the poetry that expressed those experiences to the Carmelites that were in his community, especially those who were providing spiritual direction. That's the first group that John is interested in. So it's important to remember that context. Because as we'll see, their writing broke out of those contexts, broke out of the Carmelite convents and out into the mainstream, and then people wanted to apply the kinds of things that they were doing. So from the late 17th century onward, as John and Teresa's writings began to be circulated, thanks in no small part to the printing press, there was excitement over their works, their writings on contemplation. People wanted that kind of intimacy. There was also misinterpretation of some aspects of their writings, misapplication of some of the practices they recommended. Eventually, what came to be known as the Quietist Backlash, which lasted for several hundred years. Basically a discouragement of contemplative practice and contemplative spirituality. The modern scene, beginning in the 20th century, the middle part of the 20th century, we find a renewed interest in contemplative spirituality. With the Second Vatican Council, writers on centering prayer, such as M. Basil Pennington, Thomas Keating, Father Menninger, and others. And our encounter with Eastern forms of meditation, transcendental meditation beginning in the late 1950s, and other forms of Eastern meditation that even began to be offered in retreat centers around the country. So that's sort of the broad brush. Now, I'm going to give you 3 statements here and ask you to think about this. Here are the statements. Number 1, God is beyond all our concepts and images. Okay? Number 2, to experience God contemplatively, we must go beyond our concepts and images. Number 3, experiences of silence beyond concepts and images are contemplative experiences. So, that's the setup. And I'll give you a few minutes at your table now to talk about that. How do those 3 statements taken as a whole, not picked apart, take them as a whole, how does that feel to you? How does that sit with you? What do you think about that? Okay? And then we'll check back in with you in just a few minutes. So go to it. If anybody wants to say something. Okay, just want to touch base with you. Any comments from a table? It's not necessary. You can just kind of hold it at your table. But does anybody want to say anything about this? How does this feel? How does this sound to you? This is the message that sort of broke out after John and Teresa's writings. This is what people began to teach. How many of you like these 3 as a whole? How many of you think it needs more nuancing? Sister Reen does, others. At our table too, we had a need to nuance that a little more. Well, it gives you a kind of a flavor of where we're going here, okay? And we're going to be backtracking on some earlier presentations on stages of spiritual development, on contemplation, and using some similar things, and here we go. I have to share with you, I had a very dear friend. He died a few years ago. His name was Jim Araj. He presented one of the theology institutes here, so some of you sisters might remember Jim and his wife Teresa. And he was one of the world experts on this period in history, on Quietism, and got to visit with him about it many times. So I kind of feel like because of Jim, I'm up on my Quietism. And he was actually concerned about some things going on in the church today, and you'll see where he's coming from. Let's talk about John and Teresa. Both, as we've mentioned earlier, doctors of the church today, which means to say that we can rely on their writings, their sound. And it's generally thought that they did not teach Quietism, as we're going to be discussing it in a few minutes. It's the slight tweak on their teachings that took us to a very different place. John and Teresa wrote about a lot of things, but contemplation was one of their core teachings. And their descriptions of this deep intimacy with God just really resonated with so many people who thought it beautiful, as we do today when we read about their experiences. And people got excited about their teachings on prayer. Now, recall there were many, many more people in religious communities back then than there are now. And so there was a great hunger for that kind of experience among people in religious communities as well. After the Quietist backlash, the writings of John and Teresa were suppressed for over 300 years. In fact, there are sisters in this community that have told me that in their early days they could not find a book by John and Teresa. There's Sister Avila nodding her head. She's our librarian. So they were off limits, considered dangerous, too complicated. You might get confused if you read that. And it might take you to leanings toward Quietism. Nowadays, of course, you can find their books commonly in bookstores and Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so forth. Let's go back to the big picture of spiritual development that we've been presenting, taking some of what Sister Renee's talked about and what I talked about in earlier classes. Teresa's 7 mansions, presume you can theoretically begin, she was not a universalist, with people who are outside of the mansion. They're fallen and they're caught in that. They're living carnal, unregenerate lives. Their lives are ruled by sin. They're sinners. Their mind is deluded. The will is weak, and so forth. They undergo a conversion experience, either early in life or later, and they come into the purgative stage. She divided it with her interior castle into a couple of her inner rooms. Purgative stage is a stage where we have surrendered our lives to God, but some of those old habits are still hanging on. We still experience temptation, desire to go back into some of our old ways. We're needing to practice external disciplines, as AA would put it, to find new playgrounds and new playmates, to change our lifestyle. It's a very difficult time because there is still in a person this strong desire to go back and do what they used to do. If one perseveres in that for a while, and perhaps a great while, one comes to the night of the senses. John and Teresa's understanding during the purgative state, it was common for people to experience strong affective consolations, times where they felt God's touch in their emotional life, as a sort of a reassurance from God, hey, you're on the right track. Hey, I love you. I love you in a way that competes for the old addictions and attachments that you have. God was a better drug, we might say. And I've heard people in recovery say that. After tasting the love of God, I know I can never go back to my old ways. And then when God sees that we're pretty serious about this, we're not going to give up the disciplines, God says, okay, well, let's move on here. And the night of the senses is something we come upon, a period of aridity where the consolations seem to fade somewhat. They're not as frequent. And we're called to seek more and more the God of consolations rather than the consolations of God. We're being weaned of that spiritual milk, you might say, and invited into a place where we can eat more meat and potatoes in the spirit. That brings us into the illuminative stage. Then the night of the senses might last for years. It might be very intense. It might be gradual. It's different for everybody. The illuminative stage is a time where virtue is becoming more habitual, and the work that's going on is more in the mind. We're transforming our attitudes a great deal, doing more reading, more study, developing a different perspective on life then. Teresa and John's understanding, many Christians spent most of their lives in the illuminative stage, with part of them also caught up in purgative stage issues. So this is not taking a clean step, oh, well, now I'm out of the purgative stage and into the illuminative stage. Part of us might still be caught up in attractions to addictions and so forth. Some people are invited to go further through the night of the spirit into the unitive stage. We're looking here at Teresa's 5th, 6th, and 7th interior rooms. John of the Cross calls it the unitive stage. That language is fairly standardized from about the 5th and 6th century onward. We're using that language. These 3 states or ways or stages. The unitive stage is the time when the will and the mind are habitually united with God, which is not to say you're thinking about God all the time, but you're about God's business. Who you are in your deepest self and your conscious self is about God. You don't know yourself except in relationship to God. You're living out of your true self, you might say, the self that God has transformed you into being through grace. The flowering of the gifts and fruits of the Spirit show up. People in their ministry are giving evidence of this. And so, again, you might find some people who have, let's say, partly emerged into the unitive stage, but are still mostly in the illuminative stage, so it's not all or nothing things. Part of the old language you'll find in the literature was those in the purgative stage were beginners. And so we use the term beginner in a different sense now, but the language was they're beginners. And you could be 75 years old and a beginner, okay? Illuminative stage were proficients, and unitive stage were the perfect. Now, it didn't mean they didn't make mistakes or they never sinned or anything like that, but it's this matter of mind and will being united with God. Okay, so far so good. You've heard all this so far. Going back then to that first transition, the dark night of the senses. For John of the Cross, the first dark night was very common. Most people came into it. And he described it as follows in the Dark Night of the Soul. We cannot pray as we did before, nor obtain satisfaction from our spiritual exercises. The consolations just aren't there. However, it's not because we're going backwards into our old ways. We have no interest in worldly things or attachments. And we're not sick. We're not, to use a modern term, backsliders. Okay? The purpose of this dark night is to wean one of attachments to spiritual consolations, deepen faith and trust in God. And eventually, for most people, the active forms of prayer are fruitful again. You do begin to have some sense of an affective or feeling connection with God. That's what's most common. So pretty much everybody comes into that at some point in the spiritual journey. So remember that term, dark night in the general sense. Okay? Now, John also, in the dark night of the soul, speaks of another kind of dark night. The dark night he would speak of here is called the dark night of consolation. And it can show up during and as part of that first dark night. My print is so small, I'll have to read it from the screen. He says it like this. He's speaking here of a dark night that leads to consolation, and he's contrasting it with the dark night in the general sense. Those who do not walk the road of contemplation, that is, who are being called to be contemplatives, act very differently. This night of the aridity of the senses is not so continuous in them. For sometimes they experience the aridities, and at other times not, and sometimes they can meditate. Meditate is not TM, it's considering, reflecting on Scripture, drawing implications from it, making resolutions, and so forth. And other times they cannot. God places them in this night, the night of the senses in the general sense, solely to exercise and humble them and reform their appetite, lest in their spiritual life they foster a harmful attraction toward sweetness or consolation. But he does not do so in order to lead them to the life of the Spirit, which is contemplation. And so again and again in the dark night of the soul, John is writing about another branch of the first dark night. For others, very few, contemplation becomes the staple of their prayer, implying a vocation to pray contemplatively, whether in religious life or as a layperson. And this is the prospect that excited many people. So, going back to our chart and reflecting more deeply on what John of the Cross is saying here, the night of the senses can go in one of two directions. It can be the dark night of the senses in the general sense, or a dark night leading to a contemplative vocation. Okay? So far, so good? Right. I'll pause and accept questions here, because this is the little split that gets really, really interesting. So, I'm sure you're all wondering, right? How would I know if I'm going through the dark night in the general sense, or if I'm going through a dark night that leads toward an implied contemplative journey, contemplative vocation? Well, he's already told you that in the previous quotes, hasn't he? Those who are not going toward the contemplative vocation can experience at times a return to meditation, it's fruitful again, active prayer, and so forth. Those, however, who are being called to a more contemplative pathway and are going through this contemplative night of the senses have three signs. Now, these are three signs that changed Christian spiritual history. They are foundational and pivotal, and every spiritual director in here needs to know them, okay? You will at sometimes have to discern this with your directees. Here they are. These are the three signs that one is being called to the dark night of contemplation. We cannot pray as we did before, nor obtain satisfaction from our spiritual exercises. Bingo, same as the other dark night, right? Sounds exactly the same. Second one, we have no interest in worldly things or attachments. Well, same as everyone for the dark night in the general sense. Now the third sign. The third sign is We're beginning to experience an inner quiet or rest that we are inclined to give ourselves over to. Maybe very subtle and imperceptible at first. It's the actual experience of what John called infused contemplation. So the third sign is that the person is actually beginning to experience contemplation, a desire to just rest in God's presence, without thinking, with acts of consideration, and so forth. Just be with God. John is writing to spiritual directors, remember, and he's telling them that if you have a directee, and the directee is going through this sort of a thing, and you see this, let them be. Don't tell them, finish your liturgy of the hours, finish your rosary, oh, you're just lazy, da, da, da. Because what they're experiencing in that third sign is a very good thing. It's an infusion of the grace of the Spirit. And good things are going to come from it. So that's the third sign. Questions, comments? This little detective work's getting more and more interesting. Some, yes. Some people, most people, and that is a good point, and I think I'll make it later on. Most people do experience contemplative prayer times, even mystical experiences. We learn as we talk to people more and more that they have times when they feel touches of God and closeness to God. And I think most serious prayers will have times where they just feel drawn to rest in God's presence without thinking or reading or anything. It's just enough to just be. But for contemplatives, this is like the mainstay of their prayer. They don't need a whole lot of reading before they are moved to just rest and just be in God. So it's probably not either or, but he's just trying to really tease out this call to contemplative vocation. And what John's really trying to do is to say, hey, this is a Carmelite community. We are contemplatives, and these are really the kind of people we want in our community. Think how frustrating it must be to live in a contemplative community and not be a contemplative. Right? Okay. Teresa's facing the same problem. Now, going back to looking at prayer, we can divide prayer, and I think Sister Renee, I'm amplifying on one of your things here. Vocal prayer, talking to God. Mental prayer, using our minds to reflect on the Word, make applications to our lives, break it open. All of this can be part of Lectio Divina. Reflecting on the Word, and then active recollection. The term recollection is really important. Recollection is a time when you feel your mind and your will sort of in the groove with God, but you're not in contemplation. Think of, let's see, Peter, James, and John on Mount Tabor, and Moses and Elijah appear. And what do they say? Lord, it's good to be here. Let us build 3 tents. And that's recollection. It's good to be here. It's not yet contemplation, because you're still active in your mind, you're still making considerations, and there is a form of prayer that sustains you in recollection. Teresa called it simple regard. And it would be, and here's where centering prayer takes their cue, taking just a short word or phrase and using it as a way of sustaining this kind of active recollection. Okay? So we've spent some time in prayer, we've thought about the scriptures, we've maybe made some connection with God through the scriptures. We're certainly not saying in any of this that God does not work through active prayer. That's not the message. Not at all. In fact, John and Teresa will say, as long as that works, do that. Okay? So simple regard is still a form of active prayer, but it's radically simplified. Jesus, my Lord and my God. Something like that. It just sustains that openness to God. Still on the active side of prayer. The next phase, right on this line between active and contemplative, is called the prayer of quiet, or passive recollection. Sister Renee used that term. In the prayer of quiet, I feel drawn, a connection with God deep within, that I'm drawn to let myself go into. And there's still thoughts going on, spinning around, but I'm not particularly interested in it. What are we going to have for supper? Oh, Lord. I'm not going there. I'm not going to get caught in it. I just want to be with the Lord. but these thoughts are coming and going and so forth. Then there's the prayer of union, where even the mind can become silence, where thoughts are very few. Prayer of transforming union is sort of ongoing, where our human consciousness is being transformed by grace during the prayer time and all through the day as well. Oh, back up. Oh, to do all that over again. No, stop. You have your slide here. Any questions or comments about these stages of prayer? I remember after I made a Cursillo retreat in 1973, I was in grad school at the University of Southwestern Louisiana, now called University of Louisiana in Lafayette. And I really was touched by that weekend. Some sense of God awoke in me that was not awake before, but I could see how God had been present in my life. But I made a resolution, from now on I will pray. I had no idea what exactly I was supposed to do except what I'd learned from my Catholic school education, which was 8 years. I had 4 years of public high school education, which in Mansour, Louisiana didn't matter because 100% of the people were Catholic. And we went to Mass on First Friday as a public school. So you wouldn't do that these days. Okay, so I said, I'll say the rosary before I go to bed every night. I'll start with that, and then I'll read a little scripture in the morning and think about that. We'll start with that, see how it goes. And I was meeting with a priest who was sort of coaching me. And I remember after a couple of weeks, in the middle of the rosary, I just could hardly open my mouth or move my mind to say another Hail Mary. I was in the chapel late at night, and it was just like this thick sense of presence that it wasn't especially loving or anything. It just held me deeply. And I said, I gotta finish this rosary. I told the Lord I was gonna say the rosary, but nothing in me, and something in me started saying, my Lord and my God, and that's it. I said, well, that sounds like prayer, so let's go with that for a while. And it lasted a while, and then I was able to finish my rosary. But that was my first experience of contemplation, aside from what I'd experienced in duck blinds and other places like that, where you're just drawn into the moment and its beauty, and God is part of that, you know? So that would be a good example of like the prayer of quiet. And I think many people have those times, prayer of quiet, where you're just drawn into a sense of mystery within, and it's very comfortable and peaceful. It might not be much consolation or affectivity. It's different from that, see? So I even hear evangelicals singing about this nowadays. Watch this. See if you can identify with this one.
Finding myself at a loss for words, and the funny thing is, it's okay. The last thing I need is to be heard, but to hear what you would say. Word of God speak. Would you pour down like rain, washing my eyes to see your majesty, to be still and know that you're in this place. Please let me stay and rest in your holiness. Word of God speak. Finding myself in the midst of you, beyond the music, beyond the noise. All that I need is to be with you, in the quiet, hear your voice, word of God speak. Would you pour down like rain, washing my eyes to see your majesty, to be still and know that you're in this place. Please let me stay and rest in your holiness. Word of God speak. Would you pour down like rain, washing my eyes to see your majesty, to be still and know that you're in this place. Please let me stay and rest in your holiness. Finding myself at a loss for words, and the funny thing is, it's okay.
Pretty cool, isn't it? Sounds like the prayer of quiet. What does he want to do? He just wants to. I don't want to talk. I don't have anything to say. I just want to be. And it's okay. I like it that Mercy Me is singing this to evangelical Protestantism. It's okay. Quit thinking, talking, reading. Just be. Okay? Oh, there we go. All right. John of the Cross on infused contemplation. When John speaks of contemplation, at least several scholars that I'm been in touch with on this, Jim Mirage being one, Ernest Larkin O'Corm another, say that for him, contemplation only means infused contemplation, this grace gift that begins with the prayer of quiet and deepens. And he refers to it in his writings in different ways. It's a very difficult experience to describe, but he does fumble around, and he stammers and says things like a general and pure act, interior quiet, loving knowledge, supernatural knowledge of contemplation, loving attention. The Dark Night of the Soul, he writes about it as obscure knowledge, interior refreshment, a loving and calm advertence, the sweet, peaceful, loving infusion of God. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Living flame of love, loving knowledge, passing loving advertence, interior solitude, infused love, silent quietude, emptiness and solitude, and on and on. Those are just a few examples. What those who read John began to do after John's and Teresa died and their works were circulated, they looked at the three signs and they took loving attention, because remember the third sign of being called to the night of contemplation and the way of contemplation was that one just simply liked to rest in God's presence in loving attention. They took loving attention to mean and imply an active practice rather than an actual experience. So we'll see where that goes. Something along the lines of loving attention in the sense of the prayer of simple regard. All right. For John, contemplation, as he wrote about it and talked about it, was not very common. For God does not bring to contemplation all those who purposely exercise themselves in the way of the Spirit, not even half. Why? He best knows. I love that. As a result, he never completely weans their senses. Now, senses, as you recall from Sister Renee's presentation, is not just the five senses. It's also our psychological life, including images and feelings. From the breast of consideration and discursive meditations, except for some short periods and at certain seasons, as we have said. So, yeah, most everybody at some point can experience contemplative touches, but not even half are called to this contemplative way through the night of contemplation. Now, Teresa of Avila had even stronger words for those who try to make themselves into contemplatives by shutting down their discursive life, their life of reason and intellect and the will and considerations. If His Majesty has not begun to grant us absorption, passive recollection, that's the prayer of quiet, I cannot understand how we can cease thinking in any way that will not bring us more harm than profit. Those are my bold faiths. Love must already be awake. Love must already be awake. That's infused contemplation. God gave us our faculties to work with, and everything will have its due reward. There is no reason then for trying to cast a spell over them. They must be allowed to perform their office until God gives them a better one. That's Teresa writing on that. She's saying, don't try to shut the operations of your mind down, okay? Love must already be awake. So then, after John and Teresa, their reputations as holy people and spiritual guides, translation and circulation of their works, as we've mentioned, printing press, enthusiasm for prayer and spiritual growth, many wanting to experience contemplation, and translations of John's writings. The third sign, where John is describing people who are already experiencing contemplation, began to be interpreted as a kind of active prayer and receptivity to God, rather than the actual experience of contemplation. You see what we're talking about here? John's third sign, these people, okay, meditation's not working, they're not sinners, they're not backsliders, they just want to hang out in deep loving silence with God who is calling them to that. This is their experience. And meditation doesn't even work well for them. And so people began to take that third sign of loving attention as something they could do to make themselves into contemplatives. It's similar to the prayer of simple regard. And people began to speak of, well, I'm not experiencing infused contemplation, so perhaps I could practice acquired contemplation. I could practice something that's externally and structurally like what John and Teresa are describing, and maybe that will prime the pump and God will show up and grant a contemplative grace or something. Maybe not. But John of the Cross was then considered one who was the primary teacher of acquired contemplation. And that was never his intent. He never taught any such thing as what began to be taught. Okay, so this is what acquired contemplation began to be taught as. It takes the third sign of John of the Cross to be an active form of prayer, like simple regard. Emphasizes holding the desire and the will before God in loving attention. If one becomes distracted from attentiveness to God, one can use a simple prayer word to refocus, as in centering prayer, gaze at an icon, follow one's breath, sacred prayer, sacred gesture. If God so desires, God can draw one from active into passive recollection, prayer of quiet, the first level of contemplation. Our waiting on God and active recollection, practicing simple prayer, simple regard, enhances the likelihood of experiencing contemplation. That was the general teaching, and that is, in a way, in a sense, what teachers of centering prayer are also teaching today. And there is, to my thinking, absolutely nothing wrong with this so far, okay? So far, there's absolutely nothing wrong. This is what Thomas Keating teaches, Pennington and others. And they will say that, this waiting on God is a good and holy prayer. The prayer of simple regard is the best we can do, the most we can do to draw closer to God contemplatively. Now, what the Quietists did, okay, they took this to another level. They took the teaching on acquired contemplation, which incidentally, as I've mentioned, John did not teach, to a level that John would have turned over in his grave. We're talking here about Miguel Molinas, Madame Guyon, and Francois Finlon. There were some earlier predecessors, Hesychism, Rhineland mystics, Meister Eckhart. I don't think Eckhart in particular belongs with the Quietists. Some people put him there, but he never taught the kind of things that they taught. But let's look at Mr. Quietist, Miguel de Molinas. He lived from 1628 to 1697. He wrote a best-selling book. Well, I'll get there in a minute. He was a close friend of Pope Innocent XI. That's a complicating factor because it took the Pope a little too long to act on this stuff, okay, to intervene on it. His popular spiritual guide promoted what he called acquired contemplation. I'll give you the name of the book. It's called The Spiritual Guide Which Disentangles the Soul and Brings it to the Inward Way to the Getting of Perfect Contemplation and the Rich Treasure of Internal Peace. So far as I know, it did not have a subtitle. It was a very influential book in its time, a bestseller, runaway bestseller. He was also spiritual director to many, many, many people, especially in religious communities. Following his death, over 12,000 letters were discovered that he had written to different people. Let's look at a couple of passages from his book. There are two ways of going to God, the one by consideration and mental discourse, active prayer. The other by purity of faith. Now this is what he's calling contemplation now, pure faith. An indistinct, general, and confused knowledge. The first is called meditation, the second internal recollection or acquired contemplation. The first is of beginners, the second of proficients. Proficients are people in the illuminative way, okay? Beginners don't even read this book. It's not for you. And that's also true, by the way, of the Cloud of Unknowing. The author of the Cloud will say, beginners, this book is not for you. You won't understand it. The first is sensible and material, the second more naked, pure, and internal. It's got numerous points. Point number one, thou art to know that thy soul is the center, habitation, and the kingdom of God. Therefore, to the end the sovereign king may rest on that throne of thy soul, thou art to take pains to keep it clean, quiet, void, and peaceable, clean from guilt and defects, quiet from fears, void of affections, desires, and thoughts, and peaceable in temptations and tribulations. Any little red flags going off in anybody here so far? God will stay on the throne of your soul if it's devoid of desires and thoughts. Yeah. 77, it is impossible for a man, and presumably a woman, to be able to think and live mystically in a simple understanding of the divine and infused wisdom if he does not first die in himself by the total denying of sense and the reasonable appetite. Now, centuries before, Thomas Aquinas and other great teachers had taught that mystical experience works in and through the faculties. God builds on nature. Sister Renee, grace builds on nature. Sister Renee made that point, that contemplative grace doesn't bypass the faculties. It fills them so full that they become quiet and they rest. Here they're talking about silencing them. That's a different thing. Question?
Well, is this going as a priest or a layperson?
He was a priest. Yes, layperson wouldn't have gotten a spiritual manual published.
Yeah, oh, that's right.
I don't think so. Okay, Sister Renee gave us this. John of the Cross's Image of the Soul, based really on Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, okay? There's a sensory aspect. It's the body and psychological life and its faculties of hearing, sight, taste, imagination, touch, and so forth. The spiritual part of the soul, intellect, memory, and will, and God dwelling in the center of the soul, okay? The night of the senses refers to the purification of the sensory part. That's why they call it that. Night of the spirit, of the spiritual part. What the Quietists are saying is that If we silence sight, hearing, touch, sound, memory, will, then God in the center glows and like a light bulb. Okay? All of these operations of our human psyche and spiritual nature impede the revelation and reflection of divine life. We have to silence them, and then the divine life flows, shines forth through us without any refraction or impediment by the activities of our human consciousness. That's one way of understanding what they're saying. See a problem with that? What happens to your humanity? Other quietists then, so if that's the case, if I'm just shining the divine light and I'm not consciously exercising my will and my mind, then the things that show up in my consciousness must be from God, even if they're leading me to do things that we might call sinful. Okay, Quietists became totally unconcerned about heaven, hell, and eternity. They just assumed that naturally they were all going to heaven. No concern about progress in virtue or defects after abandoning oneself to God. Why? Because it's God who acts. Why practice virtue? What could be more virtuous than God acting not in and through me, but as me? God works through the passivity of the soul. No need to thank God or make petitions. No preparation required for communion nor thanksgiving after. Let demons and nature have their way if God permits them to act. Ho-ho. No need for confession with the inward way, as one cannot sin. It is God who is acting. No need to be under authority, though external obedience is okay, and I'm convinced that's the one that really got him in trouble. We don't need to listen to our superiors and authorities anymore. Well, that's a problem, especially in religious communities. Finally, the Pope had to act. He issued a condemnation, Celestis Pastor, and the errors of the Quietists. 64 errors. Pope Innocent had to confront his good friend. And these are some of the errors, and he's stating what their errors are. Number one, that it is necessary that man reduce his own powers to nothingness, and this is the interior way. Wrong. To wish to operate actively is to offend God. Wrong. Who wishes to be himself the sole agent, and therefore it is necessary to abandon oneself wholly to God and thereafter to continue in existence as an inanimate body. That's how far some of the Quietists had gone. Vows about doing something are impediments to perfection. Natural activity is the enemy of grace and impedes the operations of God and true perfection, because God wishes to operate in us without us. By doing nothing, the soul annihilates itself and returns to its beginning and to its origin, which is the essence of God, in which it remains transformed and divinized, and God then remains in himself, because then the two things are no more united, but are one alone. Woo, what does that sound like? Anybody hear monism or pantheism? Sure. And in this manner, God lives and reigns in us, and the soul annihilates itself in operative being. Okay, these are huge errors, but they were widespread. And John and Teresa were being used as the ones who were teaching this stuff. Their writings were being quoted as the basis for this teaching, which was coming, as we saw, out of a misunderstanding of John and Teresa. Theological errors, we could say the pantheistic tendencies, God is the one acting through us. Non-sacramental, non-incarnational. God lives and works in us without us. That's not incarnational. God living and acting in and through our human nature, that's the sacramental incarnational approach. Salvation through spiritual practice. We're kind of back to this old thing that keeps coming up. Gnosticism, the Cathars, others. I mean, it just keeps showing its head in different times in different ways. We're going to perfect ourselves and get in touch with our inner divinity, and let that shine forth by annihilating basically our human nature and its goodness, our human faculties. Okay? Backlash, discouragement from reading John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila until the middle of the 20th century, suspicion of contemplative spirituality. Anybody that starts to talk about quieting your mind, following your breath, stilling yourself, it raised quietist red flags, perhaps needlessly so, but it did. Emphasis became on rational discursive meditation. This is the way for most people. Read scripture, think about it. Read books, think about it. Talk to others, etc. Contemplation was considered a rare mystical grace given mostly to cloistered religious. Probably some of you sisters in your formation heard that sort of teaching as well. I know when I first began reading about the spiritual life in the late 60s and early 70s, this was sort of the teaching that was around. And it scared the daylights out of me anyway, and I didn't want anything to do with it. So I was hoping God wouldn't drag me into a cloistered religious community. I guess that's what was going on. 20th century has seen a time of more interest in contemplative theology, thankfully, as we have gone back to some of those works, discovered where the errors lay, and began to sift through that. Second Vatican Council was an encouragement there as well, even to encouraging us to learn from the contemplative practices in other world religions, or at least to recognize some value there. The renewal movements in the late 20th century, I mentioned Cursillo, charismatic renewal. Charismatics seemed very drawn to contemplative spirituality. It was just a good fit for them. Contemplative writers, perhaps the one that did the most good to renew the contemplative tradition was Thomas Merton. His book, A Seven-Story Mountain, the publisher wasn't even quite sure they could get their money back on this book. Became an international bestseller because it spoke to a hunger people had for a more interior spirituality. Encounter with Eastern forms of religion which have well-developed mystical spiritualities, some of them congruent with ours, some of them, you just have to work with it to see how it might fit. Centering prayer, an adaptation of the prayer of simple regard that Thomas Keating and Menninger, Keating, and others wrote about from the early 70s onward. So, acquired contemplation, the question is still sort of hanging over us. Is there such a thing? Demirage said, okay, I'll grant you that there can be a legitimate practice called acquired contemplation, but let's just not bring in John of the Cross as the one who endorses this, and that's fine. But we can all, I think, learn from this. The most that we can do on our own is come to a state of active recollection where the mind and will are present to God and disposed to God's will through reading, praising God, worshiping, and so forth. And that's a good thing. Prayer of simplicity or simple regard a la Saint Teresa is an example of this simple loving gaze, and live a life of charitable service. And that was Raja's response to the question, what if I really want to be a contemplative but I don't experience contemplation? And granted, people use that term contemplation in a lot of ways. I'm trying to use it in the sense that John of the Cross talked about it. He said, well, you can still practice these forms of prayer and grow, in grace through that and live a life of faith, hope, and love, service, a Christian life, right? And that's a good thing. Somehow, in the renewal of contemplative spirituality, a message got forth that being a contemplative was better than being a non-contemplative, that you were closer to God, that it was a better spirituality. And so the question for many, what if I don't experience it? Am I doing something wrong? That's what my directees wanted. Am I just doing centering prayer wrong? I said, no, just keep practicing your prayer and accept what God gives you. We can't make ourselves into contemplatives. Watch out for excessive emphasis on apophatic methods. Apophatic prayer, remember, is a contrast with cataphatic. Cataphatic is all these methods where God speaks to us through concepts and images and words and symbols. Apophatic is God speaking to us without any of that. It's just sort of a naked openness to God. God is beyond all concepts, images, thoughts, but, and this is a big but, that doesn't follow that God does not speak to us through concepts and images and symbols and so forth, right? Of course. And sometimes teachers on apophatic methods seemingly kind of denigrate or minimize cataphatic. Conflation between the divine and human self. My deep self, no matter how deep I go, I don't turn into God. It just doesn't happen. God dwells within as God, not as me. Consciousness equals God, and we're all just limitations of that one consciousness. This is a kind of a pantheistic approach. Metaphysical enlightenment, such as we find in Buddhist systems, Zen, and so forth, some branches of Hinduism, that's the same thing as contemplation that John of the Cross was writing about, and I don't think we can say that either. We need to respect each other's mystical traditions just as much as we do our philosophical and theological traditions. There are different kinds of mystical experience out there. Pantheistic theologies, Gnostic and Arian tendencies, we're just having a blast. These things just don't go away, it seems. They just hang around, sometimes a little more persistently than others. The idea that intellectual activity magnifies delusion, that you have to put to death intellectual life in order to grow closer to God. And people, by the way, love to quote Thomas Aquinas on that. You know, Thomas at the end of his life had a mystical experience. And, he had many before that. I mean, those of you who know his life, they'd walk into chapel and see him levitating at times. This was a big man. It took a lot of grace to levitate him. And yet there he was. And so he knew the depths of God in his soul. But he had this mystical experience where at the end of his life he says, everything I've written is like straw. And so people who want to be lazy and not read theology and stuff will say, Thomas did all this work and he says it's like straw. So why should I bother reading and learning all that? I'll just pray. I don't think that's what Thomas meant. Okay, the end. We have a break time now, and you'll have more time to discuss this in our 1 o'clock session.